This is Brooke, and guess what? The On the Bias series is back. Last year, I wrote a blog series about cognitive biases and asked subscribers to vote on whether I should repeat the topic for this year. I received 31 yes and 0 no responses, so On the Bias is back. In these emails, we take a look at the cognitive biases we have as humans and how they impact our behavior change efforts. So let's get started with the 2023 series. Per usual, these episodes start with a story. And the title of this story is, I Don't Wanna. So a handful of years ago, my gastroenterologist, otherwise known as my GI guy, recommended I add more fiber to my diet. He didn't mean it in the fun way of eating awesome foods like oats and avocados and raspberries. And apparently chocolate-flavored fiber chews weren't going to do the trick either. Nope, my doctor wanted me to add a powder-based fiber supplement to my nightly routine. I was not stoked to receive this guidance as someone who at the time had recently turned 40. Was I already turning into my father? The powder-based fiber supplement is innocuous. It is tasteless, it completely dissolves in a small glass of water, and it is the easiest thing a doctor could ever prescribe me to do. And yet, I resisted. During the first 3 months of starting this habit, my spouse would ask me every night if I took my fiber. He's an annoyingly helpful accountability buddy. In response, I would channel my inner petulant child, ball my fists, close my eyes, and proclaim, I don't wanna, to the ceiling. I would then mix and drink my fiber-infused water with a mad pout on my face. So what's happening here? Well, these initial tantrums are the result of the reactance effect. I was annoyed that I was being told to change my habits. I felt resentful that another burden was added to my bedtime routine. I was even upset at the reality that I needed a supplement at my age. And reactance is often connected to cognitive dissonance. My instinctive response to these emotions was to push back and resist. So here's a definition of the reactance effect, a summarized definition. We are susceptible to responding negatively to rules, regulations, and advice that limit our options, restrict decision-making autonomy, and threaten our free behaviors. Informally, we hate being told what to do. Thankfully, my nightly tantrums have since dissipated, mostly. The drink is now part of my routine, and I have reaped the benefits of consuming more fiber. But there are examples of the reactance effect happening all around us. We witnessed multiple rounds of pushback around COVID-19 mask and vaccine mandates. There was a backlash and confusion just earlier this year over the potential ban on gas stoves, which was then backpedaled. The other week, there was consumer outcry over Delta Airlines' decision to change how frequent flyer miles are earned. Maybe you saw this in the news. And there are countless other examples of people not following signs that clearly tell them what they should be doing. Now, regardless of whether we feel these responses are right or wrong, they represent a human truth that we don't often respond well to being told what to do. Let's bring this bias home. And this is an activity you can do on your own. Take a minute to identify something you recently bristled at. It could be unsolicited advice given by a friend or family member, a seemingly nonsensical rule at a venue, or an annoying task your manager added to your plate. It will likely be a moment where your inner voice said, I don't wanna, like I did, or screw them, or make me. If you share a home with a toddler, tween, or teenager, you likely see the reactance effect on a daily basis. We are sending you hugs of support from here. So now that we have a sense of what this bias is, let's look at how it can help or hurt our behavior change programs. And we're going to start with how it can hurt. Now, this bias presents several challenges to our behavior change program, since basically what we're doing is telling or recommending audiences to do something differently, which will likely elicit a why should I reaction at the very least. if not worse. Tobias Reynolds Tyler accurately described the challenge in this paragraph from his paper on psychological reactance with health communication efforts, which is very similar to our challenges in sustainability and conservation. And his paragraph says, on one hand, messages with the objective of behavioral change or reinforcement must by necessity be clear in advocating for a specific recommended action. Though explicit persuasive messages are more likely to be understood by message recipients, they are also more likely to incite reactance due to being inherently freedom threatening in nature. Thus, a pervasive challenge for health campaigns, and I'll add in our campaigns too, is balancing the need to be direct in advocating for desired behaviors while simultaneously avoiding language that may, either explicitly or implicitly, threaten an audience member's freedom to choose their course of action. Yikes, that's like a challenge and a half. Thankfully, there are messaging shifts and approaches we can incorporate to prevent adverse reactions and pushback. We should start by decreasing our use of forceful controlling language, such as don't, can't, you must, stop, should, need to, and more. This type of language can feel prescriptive and restricting to audiences, which leads to backlash. And then on the other side of that, we should increase the use of our choice enhancing, personally meaningful, and inviting language. We can engage the audience in the effort so it doesn't feel like a top down authoritative approach. We start by shifting the call to action away from things they should not do towards actions the audience can or could take, as opposed to must and should. We can provide choice in how the audience achieves the desired goal to increase their sense of autonomy. An example of this from the health communication paper is that you can suggest that one wears protective clothing or applies sunscreen regularly, giving the user two options, instead of telling people they must use sunscreen and apply it regularly. Giving two options provides more autonomy and choice. Thirdly, we can make the desired behavior more personally meaningful and make it relevant to the audience so they don't feel like the request is unreasonable. Another thing we should do is give advance notice if significant changes are coming. This is especially true for organizational changes or changes to an existing system or program. Most backlash happens when the audience isn't warned that something will change, and they feel blindsided, meaning they feel stripped of their autonomy, their voice, and their choice. The Delta story above that I shared earlier is a perfect example of this. So there's a lot of ways that this cognitive bias does hurt our behavior change efforts. There is one way that it could help, and I do share this with a feeling of trepidation because it should not be used lightly. So there is an aspect of the reactance effect that can activate determination instead of pushback. So think of the times you've been unfairly told you can't do something. Did it make you perk up and say, well, I'll show you? Or maybe it made you want to fight the system that is restricting your rights. The Truth campaign, if you remember that campaign, took this approach when it exposed the manipulative practices of big tobacco companies. They did this to mobilize young people to distrust the companies and reject cigarettes. We've seen some similar techniques in the climate activism movement, especially with oil and gas companies. This approach is most appropriate for organizations that already have a core mission of activism and disruption, like the Truth Initiative, which has strategies in place for channeling that audience angst into action. Should not be adopted lightly. I don't recommend just slapping this onto an existing strategy or communication approach that doesn't have this built into their core mission. Another note of caution: providing your audience with autonomy and choice helps prevent the reactance effect. But this tactic can also swing too far in the opposite direction if you give your audience too many options, causing choice overload. which makes it more difficult for audience members to take action at the end of the day. So for the best balance, aim for 2 to 3 options or pathways the audience can take to achieve the desired outcome. Well, that's it for the reactance effect. The written version of this episode has many more links and some papers that you can explore if you want to dive down the rabbit hole of reactance. I hope you enjoyed learning about one of the many ways we're wired. If there is a bias that you're especially interested in learning more about, then email me, brooke@brooketully.com. I'd love to hear what's on your mind, and maybe it will appear in the series. Thank you for listening. Take care.